Hi, welcome to Learning English with Pros. This is the channel where we draw on many years of university experience to provide you with reliable information on the English language and handy hints on how to improve your English.
Hi, I've got a whopper of a German word for you to start with today. It's quite a mouthful. Rindfleisch-Etikettierungsüberwachungsaufgabenübertragungsgesetz. Apparently, it's now a dated word that originated in the German state of Mecklenburg-Pomerania, and it's to do with mad cow disease. But we're not going to attempt to translate it into English, so don't worry. What I am going to talk about, though, is long German compounds or just compounds generally. So how do we break down these very lengthy German compounds to render them elegantly in simpler English? Let's start by looking at the potential equivalences that exist between German and English, although they don't all occur with the same frequency, of course. Now, we already saw in an earlier video that very often a German compound simply corresponds to an English simplex noun. So Anwendungsverfahren can often be translated just by application. Or Reflexionstagung is a symposium. Four other types of rendition involve pre-modification. So German Amtsantritt, for instance, needs to be translated as taking office. So we have a gerund or a participle. I'd prefer to call it a participle these days. Taking office, der Amtsantritt. Then we have das Wasserheilverfahren, das Fertigungsverfahren. Where in English we also use a compound noun, hydrotherapy, production, process, Fertigungsverfahren. And we'll see in a minute that this is actually the most productive way of translating these compounds into English. So they're often rendered by other compounds. That's perhaps not totally surprising. A fourth way of rendering a compound is using an adjective in front of an English noun, so das Diagnoseverfahren becomes diagnostic method in English. Another noun containing Verfahren, ending in Verfahren, and here we have a noun plus participle plus noun construction in English, Brunnenbauverfahren, well sinking method. And Lehrergehälter is rendered as teachers' wages with an apostrophe s to mark the genitive, so using an s genitive plus a noun. We also have post-modification in English very frequently. So a noun plus a prepositional phrase, so das Untersuchungsverfahren could be rendered as the examination method, the investigation method, but it could also be the method of investigation in some contexts. The Stabilisierungsverfahren is the method of stabilization. And sometimes we have a noun plus a complement clause. So an offer to resign, frequent rendition using an infinitive. Das Rücktrittsangebot. We'll see that these renditions occur with a particular type of noun usually. We'll see which types of noun are involved later. Also, there's multiple pre or post modification. Das Crossverfahren is the method of moment distribution. So here we have method plus of plus moment distribution. Sometimes, as we'll also see in some of the more complex cases, you simply have to paraphrase a German compound because there's no English equivalent. So Lesepensum might be translated occasionally by something like reading load if it's in the context of study regulations, exam regulations, for instance. But if we have a sentence like für den Fremdsprachenlerner ist das Lesepensum wesentlich geringer, we'll need to paraphrase it as the foreign language learner will not work through anything like the same amount of reading material. Or Reflexionsstand, der aktuelle Reflexionsstand der Hochschuldidaktik im Bereich so und so. Current thinking among university specialists in blah, blah, blah. So now we know all about these potential equivalences, but how do we decide which one to choose in a concrete case, in a particular case? Well, I've done a bit of number crunching here using nouns ending in Verfahren as an example and taking them from the Collins English-German dictionary. And what we find confirms what I've already said. The most frequent rendition is simply translating a compound by a compound. But of course, we have to remember we're talking about dictionary equivalents here, and dictionaries usually record what you might call frozen examples of usage. So this doesn't necessarily mean that compounds are as frequent as you find them in the dictionary. So among dictionary equivalents, compounds are the most frequent rendition. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're more frequent in real life, if you like. You'll understand that better as we go along. So compounds, most frequent in dictionaries at least. Then we have adjective participle or adjectives participles plus noun. For instance, a duplicating process. Vervielfältigungsverfahren. There are 10 of those, so they're far less frequent in dictionaries at least, because I haven't put the number here, but I think it's 44 compounds and 10 adjective participle plus noun constructions. Simplexes, there are only 5 of those. For instance, therapy, Behandlungsverfahren, I think, and noun plus ob plus noun is in 4th place, together with noun plus prepositional phrase. So these are very rare. For instance, decision by lot, which is Losverfahren, and trial by jury, which is Schwurgerichtsverfahren, I think. 6 phrases, only one example, and this is a colloquial example, of course, etwas im Hauruck-Verfahren durchziehen, to do something in a great hurry. Now, what we've just found for general language dictionaries is confirmed by more specialist dictionaries. I've chosen my own here, the Wörterbuch Hochschule, and again, I've looked at nouns containing Verfahren, and we find the same sort of equivalence relation. The dictionary maker would obviously record these preferentially, record these compound equivalents preferentially. So we have Berufungsverfahren, appointment procedure, Datenerhebungsverfahren, data collection method, and so on and so forth. As I've already said, there are, however, few types of nouns that actually usually get translated using an infinitive. So these can be classified into a number of different meaning groups. So we have, for instance, nouns where the suffix usually refers to some kind of desire. Siegeswille, for instance, or Babywunsch, or things like that. Siegeswille is will to win or desire to win, of course, so use an infinitive here. Or a rather more complex example, der politische Umgestaltungswille der Revolutionäre, the revolutionaries' determination to remold the country. Then we have nouns that are to do with decision making or plans. Entscheidung, Plan, Pläne, Vorbereitung, Vorschlag. So for instance, Rücktrittsentscheidung, decision to resign. Then we have promises, commitments and so on. Sein bedingtes Legalitätsversprechen is conditional promise to respect the due process of law. And we have nouns that characterize attempts to do something, campaigns or initiatives, often used with with a to infinitive in English. The equivalents are, of course, so attempt to do something. Können, Fähigkeit, ability to do something, freedom to do something. And Recht, Erlaubnis, the right to do something, permission to do something. So German compounds, very often these are nonce compounds that are created on the spur of the moment, that have never existed before. They're created by the writer for the particular purpose he or she is pursuing in their text. So if you encounter a nonce creation that can't be found in any dictionary and ends in one of those nouns, you should try and translate it by means of an infinitive construction. So let's look briefly at the translation direction English-German. One of the major problems that arises here is when you have an English noun that consists of more than two constituents. So for instance, a local cookery class can be interpreted in two different ways. It could be a class on or about local cookery, so ein Kochkurs zur regionalen Küche, or it could be a cookery class that is local, that takes place locally, in other words. So that would be ein lokaler Kochkurs or ein Kochkurs in der Nähe. Usually this kind of problem is resolved by looking at the context. Things get a little more difficult when we're dealing with a specialist text like this one. This is a sentence taken from an article on education science. They were designed like the teacher belief research model of thinking aloud. Now, teacher belief research model again can be bracketed, can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It could be, I'm not going to go through all of these, let's just take a few examples. It could be a teacher belief research model. So a model of belief research that's made for teachers, if you like. So in German we might say für Lehrer gedachtes Modell zur Erforschung von Vorstellungen. What it really is a teacher belief research model. So in German that will be Modell zur Erforschung von Lehrervorstellungen. Now, Winfried Thielmann, who's written extensively about this in his habilitation thesis, overstates this case a little bit by saying this is enormously complex. It's very difficult to resolve these ambiguities. Again, I'd say if you have a little subject knowledge, and for instance, you might already have heard of thinking aloud as a typical research method that's also used in translation studies, for instance, to investigate translator behavior. You ask translators what goes through their heads at a particular point in time to find out about translation processes. So I think he overstates his case a little bit, but because usually the translator doesn't look at isolated instances of such phrases or of such nominal compounds or sequences, but rather has a knowledge of the subject, of course, subject knowledge, and the context, and so this kind of knowledge usually blocks any realistic ambiguities before they even have a chance to arise. Translators wouldn't even think about this normally. So ambiguities are quite frequent in the literature on linguistics because they're based on made-up examples that are isolated from any real context, like this one. So clearly a bit of an overstatement here. So don't worry too much about these, but do keep them in mind. Just to prove my point, I'm providing you with a few additional examples here. We have, for instance, human non-small cell lung adenocarcinoma. Well, it's obvious that this is about lung adenocarcinomas, some kind of lung cancer, and it's not about big cells apparently, but non-small cells, and it occurs in humans. So that's fairly easy to take apart on the basis of general knowledge, I'd say. However, this belief has a firm foundation both in the literature concerning parental involvement and in the school improvement research base. Of course, this is a research base about school improvement, no problem. Since there are many IAMs, whatever that is, in use in the climate change research community. Well, this is the research community that deals with climate change. Easy. Agencies that regulate the safety of goods and services have begun to address information system component trustworthiness. Well, that's the trustworthiness of the components of information systems. Again, no problem. We can see that usually these ambiguities take care of themselves. Let's move on to German-English translation. What's difficult here? Well, we've already seen that we've usually got a number of choices, a number of theoretical choices at least. Beobachtungsverfahren can be translated as observation method, which is usually the kind of frozen dictionary equivalent that I've already been talking about, but not necessarily the one you'll need in a particular context. Method of observation, the of phrase variant, is also possible. Or an important variant here is using an ing phrase, a participle, but that never gets mentioned in dictionaries. So you have to sort of unfreeze the dictionary equivalent here and think of method of observing as being equivalent to observation method, especially when there's an object behind Beobachtungsverfahren für etwas, for instance, then usually the participial equivalent will be the better one. Or, of course, we might have to use a different word. It might not be method at all, although method or procedure are standard renditions. It might also be tool or instrument. We'll see an example in a minute. Or let's take a simple compound noun like Wissenschaft in English, where we have, in German rather, where we have 4 different equivalents. It could be science, if we're talking only about the natural sciences, but if we consider the humanities as well, we'd have to say science and scholarship or science and learning. Or if we consider the humanities exclusively, we have to say scholarship. A variant that could be used for any of these, I think, would be intellectual inquiry. Now, I've dealt with this translation strategy, or it's also writing strategy of unpacking English compounds into their component parts in my book Wissenschaftliche Texte auf Englisch schreiben. So these participial solutions where you don't say evaluation criteria, but rather you use something like criteria for evaluating. So this is the case, for instance, with nouns followed by preposition and then an ing phrase. So Bewertungskriterien will be criteria for evaluating. Entscheidungsgrundlage, that's also in this list, is a basis for determining. Entscheidungsgrundlage für etwas, a basis for determining something. Verstehensrahmen, also in the list, will be a framework for understanding something. Verstehensrahmen für etwas, for instance. I'm going to take you through 3 examples of actual translation practice now where things went wrong. The first is about Erzählverfahren. I'm going to read out what the context is. Diente die Geschichte als Instrument und Argument für die Aufklärung. Es ging noch eher selten die Aufklärung der Geschichte selbst. Oft übernahm die Geschichtsschreibung der Aufklärung dabei Erzählverfahren der Literatur. History served it, this is the translation produced by an anonymous translator. History served it as an instrument and argument for the Enlightenment, and it was often not concerned with illuminating history itself. The historiography of the Enlightenment often adopted the narrative procedures of literature. This is actually the translation that the anonymous translator produced. I've now replaced it by narrative techniques, which is the correct solution. So what we're interested in here is what strategies can you use to arrive at the correct solution. And why did the translator pick a wrong solution here? Well, because he relied on dictionary equivalence, probably, and translated Verfahren as procedure. A simple strategy to use here is to look at a subject-specific corpus. Now, this is a word sketch taken from Sketch Engine, where we can see that one of the most common nouns that combines with the adjective narrative. So I've searched for narrative here, and these are the nouns that co-occur significantly with narrative. And in fifth place, we find technique. We don't find procedure. Even if we went further down the list, we wouldn't find procedure. So technique is the correct equivalent used in literary studies. So you need to search through a subject-specific corpus. If you can't find one, make an intelligent guess and use Google Books to check potential equivalence against. Here's another example. Knapp 39.000 der verdächtigen Funktionäre, darunter auch zahlreiche Tschechisten, wurden auf Stalins Weisung ohne Gerichtsverfahren erschossen. So this is about Russian history, the waves of exterminations carried out by Stalin, and this needs to be translated as around 39,000 of the suspected officials, including numerous members of the Cheka, were summarily executed on Stalin's instructions. There are two interesting things here, actually. Also note the use of instructions. Instructions is a plural noun, where German uses a singular noun, Weisung. But this is not what we're mainly interested in here. We're interested in Gerichtsverfahren, so another noun ending in Verfahren, where the dictionary would tell us that this needs to be translated as court proceedings or trial. You could also search through Lingui or ReversoNet, for instance, for potential equivalents, and you would always find trial or court proceedings. However, of course, you could then check that against Google Books again and translate it literally as shot dead. They were shot dead. This is also important. Erschießen in English, in the sense of killing someone, is to shoot someone dead, not just to shoot someone. They might not be dead then. So shot dead without trial. You find very few examples on Google Books of this phrase. So it's not a very common phrase, but it is marginally possible. However, if you do a bit of lateral thinking, you might come up with the equivalent execute. And then you might go and have a look at the typical collocations of execute. What you'll find is that execute collocates with summarily. It's the most frequent adverbial collocation of execute. It comes from summary proceedings, which is Eilverfahren. So in this kind of text, ohne Gerichtsverfahren erschossen would best be rendered by summarily executed, using the strategy I've just sketched. Now, this is another wonderful mistranslation and probably the most difficult one that I'm going to talk about today. Empfiehlt für pädagogische Handlungsfelder, one compound, strukturierte und offene Diagnoseverfahren, another compound again ending in Verfahren, zu kombinieren. And then there's a reference to Ingenkamp 1995, which you might want to check out as a translator. The translator went for recommends combining structured and open diagnostic methods for educational fields of action, which, to put it informally, is complete rubbish. What do you need to do in such a case? Well, you need to research the topic. When I was younger, about 30 years ago, and did my first translations, you actually had to go to the library physically and check out books that were concerned with these particular topics and compared German and English books. These days it's a little easier. You can usually rely on Google Books. Sometimes, though, you might actually have to go to the library. So let's see how we can solve this problem. The first thing to do is to decode Beobachtungs- or Diagnoseverfahren in its context. Now, if we look at the context, we find a few other mentions of similar things. We find offene Beobachtungsverfahren. Remember, the sentence contained offene Diagnoseverfahren. And these are defined as or described as die das Kind über seine Tätigkeitsmuster möglichst wertfrei beschreiben und in seiner selbstbestimmten Subjektwerdung erfassen möchten. Und strukturierte Beobachtungsverfahren, bei welchen Beobachtungen zielgerichtet dokumentiert werden, um dem Kind anschlussfähige Erfahrungsmöglichkeiten anbieten zu können. So, as I said, you now need to go to the library or alternatively find suitable books on Google Books, for instance, or Highwire and so on, and read up on the subject in English if possible. If you already know a little about the subject, you'll know it's about testing and assessment. So assessment is a different term for testing, basically. And the first step would be to look at a kind of handbook, an encyclopedia of educational psychology, and read the article on diagnostic assessment. What you would find, and I show this here, is that diagnostic assessment, it says it must be the first step in differentiating instructions because you use diagnostic assessments to learn what your students' varying needs are. So this shows us that assessment can be used in the plural. It's one of those nouns we dealt with in an earlier video that can be pluralized in specialist language. So instead of saying diagnostic assessment instruments, which we'd also find in this article, a shorter way of putting this would be diagnostic assessments. And it's always nice to aim for brevity in your translation. So it would be preferable perhaps to say diagnostic assessments. Now, the next step would be to use a subject-specific corpus again to find adjectives that normally occur with assessment. Does open or structured, which are the literal equivalents, of course, of offen and strukturiert, do they occur with assessment? Of course, you might also find negative evidence of that on Google Books, but you have to be careful. Always look at the author line. Where do the examples come from? Do they come from native speaker texts? Because you do find some examples of structured observation methods and so on, but they're usually not by native speakers. So what do we find in our native speaker corpus? Well, we find instrument, of course, assessment instrument. We also found that in this article, in the encyclopedic article. And you can go a little bit further here and look at what adjectives combine with assessment instruments. And you find the adjective standardized is used 7 times in our subject-specific corpus. So strukturiert corresponds to standardized, a standardized assessment instrument. Now we can translate this as standardized or non-standardized, which is the opposite, of course, diagnostic assessments. Diagnostic methods are usually used in medicine rather than educational psychology. Now, the problem that remains to be solved is the translation of Handlungsfelder into English, pädagogische Handlungsfelder. Again, you need to do some research on the internet to find out what Handlungsfelder are, what pädagogische Handlungsfelder means in German, in the source language. What you'd find is something like pädagogische Handlungsfelder sind entweder der Unterricht oder andere schulische Aktivitäten wie zum Beispiel Drogenpräventionsprogramme, Ganztagsschulprogramme, and so on. So you'd also find some negative evidence of educational fields of action on Google Books again. So you know it doesn't really work in English. It's never been used by English-speaking educationalists. So in this case, we need to paraphrase. We need to say something like either something very general in the educational process, or in teaching and learning activities. That's one thing, Unterricht, as well as other school-related programs. That's the other meaning component. Außerschulische, or not necessarily extracurricular activities, but these drug prevention programs and so on. Finally, as you know, I always like to take a look at DeepL to see how it shapes up in comparison with human translators. And actually, it does as well or as badly as our human translator, and translates this. He recommends combining structured and open diagnostic procedures for pedagogical fields of action. Pedagogical is even worse than educational here. Right, now it's your turn. Here are some sentences for you to cut your translational teeth on, which is a nice phrase we might want to deal with in one of the phraseology videos. So a few sentences to cut your translational teeth on. Im Februar 1936 löste die Regierung Baldwin ein Wahlkampfversprechen ein. Mit 14 Jahren feiern viele Mädchen und Jungen Jugendweihe. Die allgemeine Lese- und Schreibfähigkeit wurde generell als politisch erstrebenswertes Ziel angesehen. So stop the video at this point for a few minutes and we'll come back together to discuss solutions in a moment. Now, if you read a lot of newspapers, which you should do as a student of English, of course, you already know this, I think. It should be part of your active vocabulary. So when you read Wahlkampfversprechen, you should immediately think of election campaign promises. If you can't, then the strategy to use, or the strategy I'd recommend, is using the sketch engine and doing a context search. So you type election campaign into the simple query box and you type promise into the context box and search for it within 7 words to the left or right of election campaign. And what you'll find, of course, is election campaign promises. Or you might find alternatives like fulfilled one of the promises on which it had fought its election campaign, because here election campaign occurs within 7 words of promises, and this is a nice alternative. You fight a campaign on a particular promise. By the way, the corpus I've used here, you always need to select a corpus that's most suitable for your current purpose. In this case, I've selected the newspaper corpus, where you find international broadsheet corpus, where you find newspapers like the Guardian, the Times, and so on. Okay, here we're dealing with a culture-specific term, Jugendweihe, that dates back to the days of old East Germany, the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. And this kind of rite has now been revived, apparently. With culture-specific terms like this, you can sometimes simply search for them in international newspapers like Guardian. So use the search box they provide, type in Jugendweihe, and some journalist will have translated it at some point already. So what we find in the Guardian is a communist-style atheist confirmation ceremony, which isn't bad, perhaps a little tendentious. We could also have a look at Wikipedia, of course, and click on English. So look at the entry for Jugendweihe in Wikipedia, and then click on English, and you'll find an English language article that uses the term a secular or non-religious coming of age ceremony, which is another nice equivalent. So these cultural equivalences can be easily found on the web usually, or you have to make something up, something of your own. This example was simply meant to test whether you really paid attention to what I was saying. Die allgemeine Lese- und Schreibfähigkeit wurde generell als politisch erstrebenswertes Ziel angesehen. This is, of course, or these are two nouns, two compound nouns ending in Fähigkeit. And we said that these nouns are usually translated using an infinitive in English. We'd render it as an ability to read and write was generally seen, viewed, or regarded as a worthwhile political objective or an objective worth striving for. We'll talk about adjectival compounds like erstrebenswert in the next video. See you then. Thank you for watching.